All right. Hello, my name is Heather Flanagan, and welcome to the IDPro Show. Today we have Dean Saxe, Senior Security Engineer for Amazon Web Services, and my co-host, Chris Cochran from AKA Identity. So what we want to talk about today and how we're going to start this YouTube series is to dive into the articles that have been published in the IDPro body of knowledge. And one of our authors is Dean. And in fact, Dean's written more than one article, but we're only going to focus on one today because, there's only so much time. And today we're going to talk about account recovery. Dean, you first wrote this article in 2021.
That's right. I had been working in the realm of account recovery for a little bit of time, and this opportunity came up through IDPro to write for the body of knowledge. And so I thought it was a good chance to put down my thoughts and ideas on account recovery and start sharing them with others. And then presented at both Authenticate in 2021, I believe it was, and Identiverse in 2022 on this topic. And you can find some of those videos online on YouTube and other places.
Fantastic. When I think about account recovery, it just seems like a part of everyone's everyday life, right? Whether you're talking workforce or you're talking about at home. But I would have to think that account recovery is one of those things that can eat a company's lunch, especially if they don't do it right. Because if you spend a lot of time and people don't have access to the things that they need to do to get their work done, and then you're spending extra money from an IT support perspective, there's a lot of money that can go into account recovery. What inspired you to first take that stab at writing the article for account recovery, and why is it important to you?
It came up initially when I was working on FIDO implementation internally at Amazon. We had a lot of conversations about what happens when you lose your hardware security key. How do you get back into that service? How do we help users? What is our obligation to users? How quickly do we need to get them back online? And there were a lot of decision points there about both usability, security, timeliness of access, and all of those things sort of came together into a set of rules that we used internally. But I also thought about the consumer use case, right? Because I'm a consumer, you're a consumer, we're all consumers, and I lose my passwords or my credentials sometimes. Even though I use a password manager, sometimes I still need to trigger account recovery because maybe I didn't copy that password into my password manager correctly. Maybe something else has gone wrong. And so I've had obviously, as many of us have, a lot of experience in executing account recovery from the user side. And so I thought it was important to document the thought that goes into account recovery, because oftentimes I find that people want to develop authentication mechanisms and never think about account recovery as one of those authentication mechanisms. And if we leave that aside as we're building our authn system, as we're deploying our systems, we may have a significant vulnerability if we're not bringing that recovery mechanism up to the same level of security as our primary authentication mechanism. And so that was one of the initial drivers for writing it. I had also done some work with the FIDO Alliance over a number of years. So I've been a member of the Alliance for over 6 years now through my employer. And through the Enterprise Deployment Working Group a number of years ago, we wrote an article on how do you deal with loss of FIDO credentials. And the account recovery mechanism that we had to recommend was, well, you shouldn't just have one hardware security key, you should have 2 or 3 or N, which doesn't feel like great guidance, but it was the best we could do. And now as we move into the realm of passkeys, now things begin to change around account recovery, because now I have 2 places that I can recover. I can recover from my relying party, such as Amazon. If you're a user of Amazon, you could go to Amazon and do an account recovery event. But you can also recover your credentials from your passkey provider, whether it's Apple or Google or 1Password or Dashlane. And so now the mechanisms of account recovery, we have to think a little bit more broadly as we move into this new passwordless future as to what that might look like and how we get there. But it also provides new opportunities for us to make mistakes. So there's a lot of thought that has to go into this work. And my hope is that people read this article and see the videos that I've produced in the past to understand where some of the pitfalls are and how to avoid those pitfalls in their own implementations.
It's really particularly challenging when, as in all things with IT, I can't help but think of the use case of my mother and what it is that she's going to do when, she's trying to log into something, and the fact that she will never know the difference between an RP and a passkey provider. She just all she'll know is she can't get there from here, and she wants to hit a button and make it go again. Uh, Feeding into that use case while you're also feeding into, much higher security use cases where, you've got trying to access federal government services or something like that. The sheer range of what it means to recover an account and just how much you need to put into it sounds like a really hard problem to solve.
Absolutely. And it's a problem that results in fraud. So
Mhm.
in the article I wrote for IDPro, one of the stories I relate is around my wife and I. We were newly married. It was the early part of the 2000s, and she had some online accounts with some stock. And I needed to get the tax forms as I was filling out our taxes one year, which seems appropriate given the timing of this conversation that we're having right now, as everyone's doing their taxes, at least if you're American. And so I went to go log in, and at the time, we didn't have a password manager. I knew that she used a pretty common set of words for her password. So I tried all the passwords, couldn't get in. So I went to the
Mhm.
account recovery flow, and it asked for two pieces of information that are readily available: my mother-in-law's maiden name and my wife's date of birth. Well, I know both of those pieces of information, so I can log in. And in this case, it didn't just do account recovery, it actually was an alternative authentication flow. And while
Mm.
most account recovery is an alternative authentication flow, this one didn't force me to change the password or do anything with my credentials. It just dropped me into a fully functional session. I could trade
Wow.
stock, I can get our stock, I can get reports, I can download my tax forms, or in this case, my wife's tax forms, and that was sort of an instructive experience as I thought about this and thought about how badly that could go for people, because you're looking at losing potentially significant amounts of money through these account recovery mechanisms, through the abuse of these account recovery mechanisms. So we must treat them as a first class citizen when it comes to building our security systems and building our authentication services.
When you were talking in the article about actually going through account recovery, I mean, there's a many, many ways that people can go about it, and it seems like you can make it very, very security centric, which might not make it very great for the user, or you can make it, in the case of what you were talking about with your wife, very user centric. Oh, so
That's
easy to
right.
get in, but from a security standpoint, it's probably an issue. What are your tenets about setting that correct parameter, the left and right limits for account recovery for a given situation or a given company?
That's a great question because it's not actually left and right limits, but I view it as having sort of an iron triangle. So you've
Hmm.
got three aspects that you can work with. You can work with security. So how secure is this account recovery mechanism? The one I gave an example of, obviously not very secure. You can impact privacy. So how much private information do I need? Mother's maiden name, date of birth, that's all private information, right? Or if you're doing like identity proofing and you're giving a selfie plus a driver's license, that's very privacy impacting. And then there's the concept of access continuity. How quickly can I regain access? And those are the three areas that you can pull on. But as you move more, if you think of this as a triangle, if you move closer to the security vertex of the triangle, then by necessity, you're moving further away from the access continuity and privacy components of the triangle. And so, depending on the needs of your service, you may think access continuity is the most important thing and is more important than privacy and more important than security. And that would be the example I gave with the stock portal. However, in some cases, security may be the most important thing, and account recovery maybe isn't even a consideration. Maybe there is no account recovery. And that could be okay too for certain highly security sensitive services. But it does mean losing access to your account and losing access to the data in the account, et cetera. And so there is an impact to making these decisions. Unfortunately, there's no one right answer. The right answer is the one that works for you, for your customers, for your business. And we have to be creative about this and think about the mechanisms that we can use to balance security, privacy, and continuity in such a way that it meets our business objectives, meets our security objectives, and is usable by the user, because ultimately it's the user who has to trigger this event. And if they can't execute this event and execute it successfully, then maybe it's not a great account recovery strategy after all.
I like that you do focus on account recovery, which is kind of a whole complete use case because if things are done properly, people are going to have not just their, um, well, in a passwordless world, they'll have their passkey, but in the more common situation, they're going to have a password and hopefully have a second factor for authentication.
That's right.
But that just makes things more complicated, doesn't it?
It really does. And in fact, this passkey realm makes things more interesting too, because now when I go to my relying party, and I'll again use Amazon as an example here, when I go to my relying party to do account recovery, Amazon or any RP couldn't tell me where that passkey is held. So Amazon wouldn't know if the passkey was held by 1Password or Dashlane or LastPass or any other passkey provider. And so that puts some burden on the users now to figure out where does this where did I store this passkey at some point. And so RPs need to provide account recovery for their users, as well as the passkey providers need to provide some mechanism for account recovery as well, because ultimately I may lose access to my 1Password account, and how do I recover? Well, my personal strategy is I have the recovery kit for 1Password. It's stored at a safe deposit box in the bank. And so if my house were to burn down, all my computers were to go with it, I have a way to recover. But that's because I'm a nerd and I like this stuff. And so I think about it really hard and think about how do I prevent that worst case scenario from happening? But I don't expect that's the case for most people. And so we, again, have to remember the human component here and how we deal with this in a human way to allow our users to be able to reestablish access to all of the things that they want to access.
I would say for me, one of the biggest missteps that an organization can have when it comes to account recovery is not having the proper documentation, or maybe it's out of date documentation. So it's like, hey, click this link to go to the directions, and then you get a 404. And so it's like, okay, so what do I do now? And you have to go on this Indiana Jones level quest to figure out how am I going to get access to my stuff again. So I'd love to ask both of you, where do you feel like people and organizations go wrong with account recovery from your perspective? Let's start with you, Heather.
Oh, good. Well, I mean, for the first place they go wrong is assuming that it's not gonna go wrong, right? Or better yet, here's my favorite thing. Um, Give us your email and we'll send you something, maybe. But that might not have been the email that you registered with. So, but we're not gonna tell you that because that is, a security issue to just sort of start brute forcing what's in there. But now you're in this like infinite cycle of, okay, what email did I even use for me to be able to recover this thing?
Hmm.
And if you don't have the magic answer, then you're kind of just doomed.
Yep.
That's a great point. And even pulling on that a little further, you have now effectively transitioned the security of your account recovery mechanism to the security of that user's individual email account. And
Hmm.
so if you're using Gmail and you have advanced protection, you have a very secure email account, that's probably great. But what if you have a malicious administrator for your corporate exchange administrator, and they're malicious and they're going and poking in your inbox? Or what if it gets distributed to, if that mail gets distributed to a mailing list, right? There are lots of ways in which that could go wrong. And so while it is the easy button for doing account recovery to use something like a magic link in email, it may not be the right mechanism. Again, depending on business needs, depending on security, et cetera. And these are the things that we all need to kind of keep in mind. And users too need to keep this in mind, because we don't always know how a service is going to provide account recovery should we need it. And so, I can see a situation where for say a shared account, I need to share with my partner or my kids, I may set up an account recovery and send it to an internal mailing list for my family, where you could take that to a corporate example and send it to a team. And then that just expands the blast radius of possible compromise when you do that. So there are a lot of ways in which things can go wrong in account recovery, and it's really a process of creative threat modeling to think about all the ways in which things can go wrong and how do you make sure they go right instead.
Well, you said something about that in the article. Like one of my I think my favorite section in there was it wasn't, it's not just about recovering, it's about making losing access more
That's
difficult.
Hmm.
right.
And I think what you said was services should nudge their users into making good decisions.
That's right. And somewhere on the bookshelf behind me, which you can't see, there's a copy of the book Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, which I love that book because it talks about how do you help folks make good decisions that they may not make on their own. And their examples tend to revolve around financial decisions. But this is a case where, as relying parties or as services, we can help our users make good decisions. Reddit was a great example. So I signed up for Reddit a couple of years ago. I added a second factor to my account, and it reminded me when I had that second factor. If you lose the second factor, you've lost access to your account. Here's your recovery codes. Copy them down, store them safely, because if you lose access to your recovery codes too, it's game over. We can't get you access to your account again. They don't really support account recovery beyond that recovery code, or at least they didn't at the time. And so that's a pretty firm nudge to me as a user to tell me what I need to do. But there's more subtle nudges that we can do. So, for instance, I've talked about using FIDO hardware security keys, and the idea is that you probably want to register multiple hardware security keys if you're using hardware security keys. If you're using a passkey provider, you've got some backed up to the cloud somewhere, and so you've got some durability with that passkey that you don't now need multiple providers. But from an RP perspective, I can nudge my users to configure multiple MFA mechanisms. They're not necessarily all going to be at the same level of strength,
Hmm.
but they are going to provide that durability in case I've lost that primary mechanism. I can fall back to a secondary mechanism. So maybe my primary mechanism is my hardware security key, and my secondary mechanism is SMS OTP. I wouldn't necessarily
Hmm.
recommend SMS OTP to anybody, but it
Right.
may be that backup that I need in the case where my hardware key is not available.
Hmm. What else would you recommend to folks that have to deal with account recovery? Because I would say that the best way to deal with it is not have to go through that process of getting your account recovered. But what would you
That's right.
recommend to folks to be able to maintain everything from passwords to understanding which second factor authentication mechanism to use for a given application or service? What are some of your tenets for folks to adhere to there?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, use a password manager, and I should probably stop calling it a password manager these days because now it's really a credential manager. But
Hmm.
use a credential manager. Use it consistently. Use it every single time and every single place that you create and manage credentials. That's the first thing, right? Make it hard to lose access. If you're using a credential manager, make sure you understand how to regain access in case of lost access. So I mentioned 1Password's account recovery kit, Dashlane, LastPass, Apple, they'll all have different mechanisms by which you can do that. This also then allows you to get into the ecosystem of passkeys, and specifically synced passkeys offered by all of these platforms where the RP supports it. That is a better credential because it's not something I ever have to remember. It's not something that can be easily stolen. It can't be directly phished during your authentication transactions, etc. And so these are better credentials, and by being backed up in that password manager, now again we have that durability because they're available in the cloud, and I can restore access if I know how to restore access. And so there is always this bit of the human and the end user having to take care of things themselves. We can help the user, but ultimately the user has to take some ownership of how they manage and store credentials and how they ensure constant access to those credentials when they need them. But hopefully, we continue to make it easier and easier and easier on users. And I mean, I've mentioned I'm a 1Password user. I'm also an Apple user, and I would say that both of those companies and Google as well have made it easier and easier on the user. But it's still challenging for non-technical users. I think we still have work to do as identirati, as humanists, to think about how we continue to make it easier for Heather's mom to gain access to her credentials and know where they are at all times. So We're going to keep working on it, though. It's not done. We're not done yet. We still have a long way to go.
So I have an enterprise level question,
Sure.
and this is just me thinking, big picture of, um, is it even possible these days to suggest in an enterprise that you allow an account recovery, but any recovered account would automatically have a lower access level, fewer permissions until someone really can follow up and just double check and make sure that this was actually the person that they think it was. Is that something that happens these days?
It's funny. I was just having a conversation with Pam Dingle at Microsoft the other day, and she mentioned, I think they call it in Entra, the temporary access pass or TAP. Um, I called it out because I thought it was talking about like a FIDO hardware key and tapping the FIDO hardware key, but in fact it is this temporary password. And my understanding from Pam is, I'm not an Entra user, so I'm not an expert here. My understanding is that that could come with a lower level of authorization attached to that until you get back to having a standard set of credentials, whatever they might be. So yes, I think there is a model for that, Heather. But I also think you have to look at what is the mechanism you use for account recovery. Perhaps you do an account recovery where you have to go physically show up at a help desk and provide some identifying documentation. It could be your corporate badge, it could be your identity documents, and use that to recover. It could be that your company's doing some sort of identity proofing when they onboard you, and then they're doing a re-identity proofing step in order to reestablish a new credential, maybe a new passkey or a new FIDO credential. Or it could be mediated through someone who knows you well, your direct manager. In person, this works really well. As we start to get into less and less in-person interactions, I personally work from home. It makes it a little bit harder. Certainly, the rise of AI and deepfakes are going to influence that over time, and so we do have to keep those concerns in mind. But there are mechanisms using trusted third parties, trusted individuals, where you can re-bootstrap a credential with a reasonable level of assurance that you are dealing with the right person at the right time. And it's again up to individual enterprises to figure out what's going to work for them. And maybe, depending on your enterprise, maybe the right answer is there's no access until you can physically show up in person and do that bootstrapping event again in person. And that's a reasonable compromise for a high security service.
Mhm. Dean, when you think about the future of account recovery, where do you hope we go? Like do you, looking into that crystal ball of the future, where do you hope we go as a whether it's through process, through technology, or anything in between?
Oh wow. I don't really know. I hope in general we get to a place where people consider this as a primary consideration in building their authentication services. I think too few companies, too few developers are thinking about recovery because we like to think about the normal case, right? We
Mhm.
like to think about, oh, everything's easy, everyone's got their credentials, it's all easy squeezy, everything works. Well, we know that doesn't work in the real world. And we also know from the real world that this tends to get a second class citizen type of a treatment. A lot of these account recovery mechanisms are not easy to use, are maybe not as secure as we would like them to be. Um, so education first is kind of the primary thing. Let's get people educated as to what it means to account recovery and what the risks are, because there are true risks. Um, Longer term, I think we're going to see more and more mechanisms around identity proofing, the use of MDocs like mobile driver's licenses, basically that can assert to the human's identity remotely because you trust, say, the Washington State Department of Licensing, and the Washington State Department of Licensing said this is me, and so now I can use this to prove it's me, but do so in a remote fashion as opposed to an in-person presentation of that document. I think the example I used in the article was going to my bank with my passport or my ID documents. But we could do that remotely at some point now or in the near future. I think that's where we're going to see more and more happening, at least in the parts of the world where everyone has a fully featured mobile phone, smartphone. But that's not the world we live in, because there are parts of the world where people don't have their own personal device. Maybe they have a feature phone, but they don't have that personal device. So we need to keep in mind that not every user is going to have the same type of mechanisms to rebootstrap a credential, and we need to adapt to the local environment that we're working within. And so as you move out of, say, I live in the U.S., and so my view tends to be somewhat U.S. North America centric. But as you move out of the U.S. and you move into other parts of the world where people are sharing devices, we need to think of other mechanisms. In India, for instance, maybe Aadhaar is that mechanism. I don't know, but we're going to see a transformation here as countries and states do more of a digital transformation and provide more digital credentials to their citizens. I think that's going to be sort of the next evolution, but it does have a privacy impact depending on how we implement it. And so we have to be considerate of that privacy impact. And if there are ways to minimize that through mechanisms such as zero knowledge proofs, then we should be minimizing the privacy impact of the individual while maximizing the security and the utility of this system.
You knocked it out of the park, 100%. One of the things that we wanted to talk about with just about everybody, Heather and I, we want to talk about when people got into identity to begin with. Because for me, in my career, there's several inflection points where I got into threat intelligence, when I started leading security operations. But what would you say is that one inflection point that pushed you towards identity? What was there something, was there a moment in time where you said, this is what I want to focus on?
My boss said, "Hey, Dean, let's go to Gartner's Identity Conference down in, I think it was Vegas or San Diego or something." Okay, sure, let's go. And I saw Ian Glazer up on stage, and I met John Fontana, who was at UBCO for a number of years, and met a number of folks in the industry there, and thought, wow, these people are really smart. This is a really interesting area. I'd been working in security for about 10 years by that point, but hadn't really considered identity as its own practice. And so at the time, I was at the Gates Foundation and working in security in the Gates Foundation, and did some work there around identity management for our internal employees as well as our external collaborators. And then as I left and moved to Amazon in 2013, I believe it was, I joined a team at Amazon that dealt with the identity of Amazonians. And so that was really where I started thinking a lot about how do we onboard, how do we offboard, so joiners, movers, leavers, and that's when things started to really crystallize for me. And a few years after that, I got involved with the FIDO Alliance. I led a team dealing with identity for Amazonians internally. I met Sarah Cicchetti, who introduced me to Heather, who introduced me to all sorts of people, and away we go. And so, over a period of about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years after first getting introduced to identity, I kind of met a key group of people who exposed me to more and more interesting ideas in identity. And that's what led me, to the FIDO Alliance, to the OAuth working group, to the shared signals framework, work that's happening in the OpenID Foundation, and really made my identity career blossom into what it is today.
I knew we'd get you sucked in, Dean.
Yeah, you did. But it's been fun because, these identity folks, they're a lot of fun. They're really smart. They think really deeply about big human facing problems. And that's the kind of work that I want to do. A year and a half ago, 2 years ago now, I said to my leadership, I wanted to focus entirely on standards, and particularly standards in identity, because I'm nearing the end of my career and I want to make a difference, and I want to be able to look back someday and say, I did this, and this is the impact that it had on either people or the world, or however you want to look at it. But I want to be able to look back and say, I did that thing, I accomplished this, and I helped make the world a better place for other people.
It's just beautiful, man. Truly. I love that. And you are making a difference.
Oh, thank you, Heather.
So what are you going to be producing next? Like, what are you writing? What are you working on? Where are you going to be speaking?
Ooh, this is a good one, Heather, because doing a lot of things. So right now I co-chair the FIDO Alliance's Enterprise Deployment Working Group. So Last year, we produced a number of papers on how to deploy FIDO in enterprises, everything from relatively low assurance, replacing passwords, to very high assurance environments. I'm going to continue that work through this year, and we have some exciting things planned for this year coming from that group. I'm speaking at Identiverse real soon in the end of May. I actually have 4 talks at Identiverse, which I'm a little bit scared that I've got to produce 4 talks. But first, the first one is going to be on Skim, and I'm going to be presenting with my colleague Anjali Segal. And Anjali and I are going to talk about hyperscaling Skim for enterprise environments. The second is going to be a masterclass that I'm doing with 2 of my colleagues, Jugal Keshkani and Jamin Bat. And we're going to do a masterclass on how do you debug FIDO implementations at scale, because it turns out there's a lot of complex interactions in the FIDO space, and in order to debug a customer problem, you need to understand: is it the browser? Is it the hardware key? Is it the passkey provider? Is it your RP and their software? Where does the bug exist, and then how do we unwind that? The third is a continuation of my Thinking Differently About Passkeys series that I started last year, where I'll be maybe presenting some more Venn diagrams to go straight to Eve Mailer's heart, and talk about some of the changes that have happened in the passkey ecosystem since speaking about the topic last year. And the last one is the one I'm really excited about. And Heather knows this one well because we've spoken about it a couple times. About 13 years ago, a good friend of mine passed away very young. He was 39. And one of the things I started thinking about at that time was, we lack a mechanism to be able to consent to how do we want our digital estate, our passwords, our passkeys, all of the digital data that we've left behind. How do we want to transition that to someone else when we die or when we become disabled? Last year, my friend Vittoria Bertocci became very sick and unfortunately passed away in October, and that started me thinking about this process again. And so I put together an abstract for Identiverse, where we're going to talk about death, and we're going to talk about how do we, as a community, as Identirati, as humanists, how do we come together and provide mechanisms to enable humans to consent to what happens to their data. Because right now I can go to Apple and I can tell Apple what I want, or I can tell Facebook what I want, but I don't have a centralized place, like maybe a wallet or maybe a password manager, or maybe something integrated with the software that I use to create my will, or that the lawyer is creating my will, that I can say exactly what I want to happen. Do I want to delegate access? Do I want to remove access? It's important that we have some way to deal with our digital emissions when we've died. Kalia Young pointed out to me that someday there will be more people who had a presence on the internet before their death than are alive today. And I don't think we've reached that tipping point yet, but it's coming. And so how do we deal with all of that data and all of the accounts, et cetera, that those people have left behind? So that's the thing I'm really excited about.
Dean, so good that you're carrying on the work of your friend and the things that you all were working on together. I mean, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for taking time out of your busy schedule to hop on the mics with us and chat about all things identity. We're going to drop everything into the show notes below, the link to your body of knowledge article, the things that you have coming up. But also thank you to IDPro and AK Identity for allowing Heather and I to go on this journey of exploring all the folks in identity. We'll also drop those links down below so you can learn more about those organizations. And with that, we will see everyone next time.